Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the US Futures Weekly Chart Analysis for the week ending 10th of October 2025. First chart is the US dollar index futures, which closed higher this week. Been a lot of talk about this market moving lower over time, but last week it did appear that the market would like to go higher, and that's what happened this week. Price pushed up, but it did come back and close at this level. This is an intermediate level. It's the equilibrium found when this bar pushed higher, and the close was really the equilibrium level found. And that's where the market's pulled back to this week after pushing above it earlier in the week. So that was unsurprising, really. I think this market will find it a little more difficult to continue higher here. There'll be resistance at this level most likely. So if it continues higher, that'll be the target level, perhaps over a couple of weeks. But I think the market will find it a little more difficult to move above this equilibrium level through here. Supply was drawn out initially on this bar, you can see, and the same thing happened this week on this bar. So while the market may attempt to continue higher, it'll find it a little more difficult than the way it moved with relative ease up to this level this week. The increase in prices in this market really did affect some of the associated markets this week and caused a little bit of damage, which we'll see as we move along. Next chart is the E-mini S&P. This is S&P 500 index futures. They moved lower this week. Prices come back almost to this level here. You can see the levels are really squashing up together through here to some extent. This is not a market that's moving with relative ease. This market's grinding higher at the best or making incremental increases in value, and it's not really moving with relative ease. The market pulled back to this level this week. I expect there'll be an attempt to stabilise around this level, sort of in here. You've got this level right next door as well. I expect there'll be an attempt at least to stabilise in this level here. Volume increased in line with the increase in spread, which is exactly what you would expect, and the close little off the week's low and back just above this level where the market used as a bit of a launch pad a few weeks back. US Treasury 10-year note futures. They continue to trade overall within this larger range. Price did push higher this week after a little test for supply below the previous bar's close, and then pushed higher, which is what you'd like to see in a market. I expect the market will attempt to move up to this level over the next week, or at least attempt to do so. A failure to do so would actually be a little minor sign of weakness. So we'll see how that goes. Now the market's made a little bit of an attempt to move higher. You would expect it will reach the logical level, which is this level up here that I've arrowed. So we'll watch that in response. I do note that volume was reduced this week, even though spread increased and it pushed higher. So there wasn't a great deal of oomph behind that move higher this week. It's really floated higher on a lack of selling pressure. So any weakness that did emerge or pressure in the market would see this market fall over pretty easily because it really only floated higher on a lack of selling pressure. It didn't really move higher with increased demand. So just keep that in mind. Next chart is copper price futures, which had been going quite well over the last couple of weeks until the US dollar moved higher. You can see the market attempted to move higher here, and then as the US dollar gained some ground higher, this market was then put under pressure and it pulled back somewhat. And volume did increase. which balanced pretty well against the increased spread this week. I don't think a great deal of damage has been done here, and this market is actually known for over-exaggerated spreads to some extent. Take this one, for example. So it doesn't surprise me that the market pulled back with an increased spread this week. It may come back to this level, this equilibrium level here, found when the market initially pushed away 3 weeks ago. And the level below that is obviously this level. Gold price futures. Gold price futures was also under a little bit of pressure this week. The market did move higher, but closed well off the week's high, about mid-bar, on pretty high volume. You would reasonably expect this market will test for supply at least next week. It will come back initially to some degree, and then test for supply at least for part of the week. This is pretty high volume. The close off the high suggests there was some selling pressure in the market. It was probably shorter term traders just getting out for a profit. But that being said, generally markets will respond logically, and the logical response is a test for supply at the very least, which is below the previous bar's close, and testing the market to see just how much supply is there. Sometimes it happens just naturally, sometimes it's more deliberate. But either way, the market will generally test for supply when supply is being drawn out. And if supply continues to be drawn out, it'll move a little lower in response. And if there's not much supply drawn out, the market will move sideways or up. So that would be the expectation, at least early next week, for the market to come back a little and test for supply. Silver price futures. There's a lot more traders in the silver price, and it often is a little more volatile than the gold price, and that can be seen in this week's chart. Price attempted to move higher, and then with the strength in the US dollar causing some supply to be drawn out, the market really sold down to some extent, and that's traders getting out to a large extent, shorter term traders. Volume was pretty high. The close was still within the previous bar's range, so very little damage has been done. It's just a awkward looking bar that's been developed because of the attempt to move higher initially and then the push lower in response. The market's closed at a reasonably logical level. This is the highs of this bar. There was a test for supply below the previous bar's close here before the market pushed higher, and it's come back this week and closed pretty much at that level again. So it is a logical level. Now supply has been drawn out, so similar to the gold price, you would expect at least early next week some form of testing for supply to see how much supply is actually in the market. So you would expect something like that early next week, and then a response depending on how much supply is actually drawn out. Like crude price futures, for the first time in quite some time, have broken below the important level, this trading range we've been looking at for a long time. It did have the lowest close for some time last week, and there was an attempt to move higher initially, and then supply was drawn out pretty much in line with the strength in the US dollar to some degree. I expect there will be some support drawn out from these levels to the left. I'm not sure whether the market will be able to reverse immediately, but I do note that volume actually reduced this week despite price breaking down. So this wasn't active selling so much as the price drifting lower on the back of strength in the US dollar. It wasn't really an active selling event, at least not yet anyway. But price has broken below the important trading range it's been in for some time, and it did actually close slightly below this level as well. So we'll just see where it settles. It hasn't actually closed at a really logical level this week, and maybe a little overdone in the short term. We'll see. into the currencies now. This is the Euro-US dollar currency pair. Price pulled back this week with the strength in the US dollar. There was no attempt to move higher at all. Price just moved lower, below the previous down bar's low, and back to this level here where the market has found some support previously. So it's closed at a fairly logical level. I expect there'll be an attempt to consolidate here, but further strength in the US dollar may see price come down to this level. So we'll just see how that plays out. But at this point in time, the market's pulled back as expected, and it's closed at a logical level. British pound currency futures. British pound currency futures also came back this week. It also closed at a logical level here. If there's further strength in the US dollar and this market's under pressure, similar to the euro, this is the level that is likely to see price move its way down to. Japanese yen currency futures, they actually gapped lower this week on a very strong increase in volume. Price pushed down to this lower level. Found some support later in the week. Some buying support has come in down here at the lows of the range to see the market close just a little above this level here that I've got marked. So there was some support drawn out this week, which may see price knocked sideways and perhaps not continue lower, at least in the near term. Volume was quite high, so there was a lot of activity in the market this week. We'll just have to watch for the next couple of weeks and see which side, the buyers or the sellers, is able to gain the upper hand. But at this point, the market has broken down from this level. It did look vulnerable last week, no doubt. And it's gapped down below this bar's low to this next lower level, found a little bit of buying support at the lows and closed just above them. Aussie dollar currency futures, they were also under a little bit of pressure with the strength in the US dollar. It's understandable. Price broke below the low of that bar. It's sort of suspended in midair here to some extent. It hasn't closed at a logical level. We'll just have to see how much weakness or strength is drawn out of this market. If the US dollar continues higher, you would expect this market to come back to this level. And if the US dollar does pull back somewhat, this market may float up to this level. At this point in time, it's not closed at a logical level. It's sort of hanging there, waiting to see what other associated markets are going to do to some extent. Bitcoin futures. Bitcoin futures attempted to move higher this week, even though the logical response to last week's up bar was a test for supply in here. But that didn't happen. This market attempted to continue with the momentum in the market and continue higher. And then it was met with strength in the US dollar to some extent, and that caused weakness in risk assets, and this market's moved lower in response. Now, there was some buying support drawn out later in the week. That's to close off the week's low. Volume was about average, so it wasn't overdone. It was genuine trading. The market attempted to move higher. The US dollar moved higher as well, which put some pressure onto this market, and price came back in response. The market's closed within the range of the previous up bar, so no great deal of damage done. I expect if the US dollar continues higher, price will probably come back to this level. And if the US dollar actually turns around and goes lower again, price will probably float up to this level, or maybe even adjacent to that bar's high up there. So you can see where we are. The market's just pulled back. It's closed in the range of the previous up bar, which is okay. It's safe and sound. There's no great damage done. And we'll just see what response there is probably in line with the US dollar to some extent. This market trades pretty close to the NASDAQ in the US, or at least similar. And if that market's moving higher or risk off, or there's risk off, this market will probably float higher in response. And just back to the US dollar index futures quickly. You can clearly see where we are. You can see what's happened this week. The market's moved up to this level. You've got a level above here, level above that there. I expect it to be a little more difficult to move up here than it was to move up this week. This week was easy. It floated up below average volume. It was increased volume, but below average, just below average. And it went up there pretty easily. As soon as the price moved above this level, like it did on this bar and this week, supply was drawn out. So while this market may attempt to continue higher, I expect it to be a little more difficult to do so than it was this week. And price may even just come back to this level where it's been trading for quite some time, because that's the safe level. It's easy in there with no serious issues. Okay, thanks for your time. Back again next week. See ya.